Good afternoon. I am Carolyn Brown. I'm the director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the library, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for what promises to be a very interesting and enlightening, I believe, discussion on commercialization of academic research within the university setting. I'd like to offer a special warm welcome to Tim Cook and Tom Hockaday, who have traveled all the way from Oxford University to be here today, and also to Mark Frankel, who fortunately only had to travel across town to get here. My appreciation to all of you for coming on the eve of a holiday. The town is beginning to empty out, and all of you have stayed. The Librarian of Congress, who had hoped to be here to introduce this event, sends his apologies. He's getting ready to leave the country for several weeks and found that his schedule was so compressed he could not attend. But he sends his warm greetings and sincere apologies. Today's event is organized under the auspices of the John W. Kluge Center here in the library. Through a generous endowment given by John Kluge, the center brings together the world's best thinkers to conduct research and distill wisdom from the library's resources. As appropriate, we try to create opportunities for researchers who are in residence to interact with policymakers in Washington. And that is one reason we are especially pleased with today's event, which promises to be an occasion for just that kind of combination. Let me say a quick word about the Kluge Center itself. The center is a place for scholars to spend periods in residence ranges from 2 or 3 months to sometimes as long as 10. The scholars range in experience from dissertation fellows to postdoctoral fellows to some of the world's most senior, outstanding scholars. And the subjects of people's research ranges from really whatever the library's collections will support. And we say of the collections, they'll support anything except clinical medicine and agriculture. So that gives you a sense of the breadth of the kind of scholarship that is done here. For this particular program, we would like to give special thanks to another division which has participated in this, the Science, Technology, and Business Division of the library, who are co-sponsors, and especially Tomoko Steen, who's been so very helpful in sharing her expertise and her contacts. I would also like to give very special thanks to Oxford University for its generous financial support, and I would add strong intellectual support for today's event, and especially to one of its star researchers and entrepreneurs, and our pleasure to have had him as a Kluge scholar, Raymond Dweck. Dr. Dweck is the visionary behind this event. He holds the Kluge Chair in Technology and Society and is a professor of glycobiology in the Department of Biochemistry at Oxford University, where he also heads Oxford's Glycobiology Institute. He's the author of numerous publications and patents, and has contributed substantially to some of the principles and perspectives that we will be hearing about today. Just a few words of context. In the US in recent years, we have witnessed a great deal of discussion about the relationship of universities to private enterprise. By tradition, and I guess one could say public expectation, university researchers are expected to conduct research in their fields of personal interest and to be motivated by the pursuit of knowledge and truth. And they're rewarded through salaries and research budgets and all of the things that you know about. On the contrary, as we tend to frame it in this country, the motivation for commercial activity is the bottom line. And I think probably no one here would dispute that commercial activity provides a great deal of good and also generates knowledge, but its motivation is somewhat different. These two groups tend to view each other, I think, sometimes with hostility, sometimes with suspicion. And part of our hope from today's discussion is that there are ways to draw from the experiences of Oxford University and those of actually of all of you in the audience to think about this relationship in another kind of way. To set the framework then specifically for today's Dr. Baruch Blumberg,
who's right here to my right. Dr. Blumberg, we will claim him first, is a member of the Library of Congress's Scholars Council, which provides advice to the librarian on the Kluge Center. And he also chairs that center's steering committee. So we put him to a lot of work for us. He also, Dr. Blumberg is a Nobel Prize winner in medicine in 1976 for his pioneering work on the vaccine for hepatitis B, and has, in that context, made an enormous contribution to world health. I won't go through his bio, which is in your package, but I would also note the Oxford connection here is also very strong. Dr. Blumberg was Master of Balliol College from 1989 to 1994. I guess that's 6 years. So the Oxford connection is really strong here, and I think our discussion should be most interesting, and I would ask you then to please welcome Barry Blumberg.
I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the American Philosophical Society, which along with the Library of Congress, the Kluge Center, and other divisions of the Library of Congress are sponsoring this event. The American Philosophical Society was founded in Philadelphia in 1743 is the date we usually give. By Benjamin Franklin and some of his colleagues, and its professed purpose was for the promoting of useful knowledge, which is, in a sense, the theme of this meeting. Now, the emergence of the Enlightenment as a powerful philosophical movement advanced the idea that progress and betterment could be achieved by the application of reason. Natural philosophy, that is what we now call science, would be the means by which knowledge would be greatly increased, and this knowledge could be used to improve the material well-being of humans. The notion of knowledge and its application were linked from the inception of this powerful movement, which more or less still prevails. And I was on this wonderful tour we had of the building today. It was pointed out to us that the painting in the highest part of the library is of enlightenment. I think it's difficult to see without a pair of binoculars. And it shows a metaphoric woman taking the blindfold off her eyes, which was the intent of the Enlightenment, which admits us to all this knowledge. So when Franklin set up the society, he did it on the basis of a proposal that he made, and we're going to hear more about this later. But in effect, he said, we've finished with the business of getting a colony going. Let's now develop this kind of internet of savant scientific people living around in the British plantations and bring them together so that their knowledge is not lost and it's recorded. And we started proceedings and transactions which are still in print, and they've recently been scanned by Google. So if you happen to be on an elevator in Singapore that has Wi-Fi and you want to find out what Jefferson's contribution in the 1780 proceedings are, you can do it with a little persistence. Now, he went ahead, and again, our first speaker is going to deal with this in greater detail. But he lists all the things that he hopes is going to emerge from them. I'll just read some of them. You can just imagine Franklin sort of sitting, every time he had a thought, he put it to paper. And since he was a printer, it was published within a short time and published in multiple copies. So he wants to talk about all the newly discovered plants, herbs, trees, roots, etc., their virtues, etc., methods of propagating and improvement of vegetable juices such as ciders, wines, etc., new methods of curing or preventing disease, new and useful improvements in any branch of mathematics, new discoveries in chemistry such as improvements in distillation, brewing, the assaying of ores. He had a focus on alcoholic beverages, new mechanical inventions for saving ladles, mills, carriages, methods of conveying water from one place to the other, and also for navigation. So he had a comprehensive, he had a really optimistic view of what you could do with knowledge and its application. Now, the society was modeled on the Royal Society and on the Dublin Society, later the Royal Dublin Society. And whereas the focus there was very often on pure knowledge, Franklin made it very clear that it was applied knowledge that he wanted to come from this. And his proposal was addressed to what he referred to as the leather apron folk. That would be people like himself, a printer wore a leather apron, carpenters, merchants, sailors, navigators, people who actually did things. And that was his intent. Now, his idea that you could study basic science and then apply it, I think is fundamental to what we'll be discussing today. And perhaps this is my interpretation, but it symbolizes, epitomizes the belief, you could even say a faith, that if you're engaged in basic, pure science, curiosity-based science, that will eventually result in some wholesome application. And I think much of the basic science that goes on in the United States now, which for many years has been very well funded by our country, is based on that notion, that something good's going to come out of some esoteric exploration. And that has certainly proven to be the case. And in my view, the reason that we still continue to be ahead in innovation is because we've invested so heavily in basic science, and to my mind will continue to do so. And again, you'll hear that Franklin was very much involved in putting the patent law in the Constitution, the idea of a patent law. And he was one of he, as you know, was not only was in on the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but although he was quite old, took part in the writing of the Constitution. And I think you have to say, since he was a big person for making compromises, that he was probably was responsible for the various compromises we have in the Constitution for positive and negative outcomes. But as he said at one point, if we didn't have the compromises, we wouldn't have a country. Now, he was also a great entrepreneur. He retired when he was in his 40s, and he's able to spend a lot of his time after that in his scientific experiments and his scientific interests, again with the focus on application, and also for his life in politics, and more particularly, he was an ambassador, in effect, of the United States in Europe from a very early time after the start of the Revolution. But he was, I think, perhaps the first person who used the franchising technique. When he retired, he made a deal with the person who bought his print shop that he would get a percentage of the income. And he kind of lived on that. He was actually a fairly wealthy person, but frugal. He didn't get into debt the way, for example, Jefferson did. And but he also set up printing establishments in different parts of the colonies. And he would get a percentage of their income based on his supplying print and the machinery and knowledge and kind of apprentices And then and he actually gained money from that. Now, he was the Postmaster General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the colonial period, and he was later made the Postmaster General of all the colonies of the British plantations. And he used that to his advantage. I mean, he got good rates for the distribution of his books and his newspapers and his publications. And he built up contacts through his frequent travel. He traveled all over the colonies. He loved traveling, liked to go places. But he also strangely made the point that not everything gets applied. It's hard to find things that he worked in that were not applied. One of them is he had these strange magic squares in which the diagonals and the up and down, the horizontals and the verticals all added up to the same number. And very often when he was sitting in on the boring sessions during the hot summer in Philadelphia with the windows closed because it was a secret session, he would be writing away on these magic squares. And he also, for example, when he came back from Paris via London, via England, the South Coast, he continued on to the United States, and his grandson, Temple Franklin, came along with him. And on the route back, they took temperature measurements and plotted the geography, you might say, of the Gulf Stream. Now, that was of interest for basic science, you might say, but he realized from his conversations with New England sea captains that if you could figure out where the Gulf Stream was, you could cut a day off the trip from North America to Europe. And if you kept out of it on the way back, you could add a day. So these measurements, which he took with great care, and by the way, have been validated by measurements from satellites and so forth, where you can actually measure the temperature from orbit, that it was quite a close fit. So he used that as in his this constant interest in applying the scientific knowledge he had. Well, I'm looking forward to this kind of summary, what's happened at Oxford when I was there. I took an interest in this technology transfer program. I was involved with the Maudlin Science Park, and Raymond was on our science advisory committee then, and I witnessed the establishment of the University Science Park in Oxford and the ISIS Innovation. And it's very exciting what's happened there over the course of a relatively short time. And I'm looking forward, along with all of you, I hope, in hearing this story. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, and let me add my welcome to you all, and Tim and Tom for coming over from Oxford, and Mark, thank you very much for being here too. I'm going to just spend about 5 or 6 minutes giving you some background, and you might almost call this a case history before I hand over to Tim Cook. And so if I can have the first slide. I'd like to say that it's been a privilege to be here at the Kluge Center. I think people will remember that I've been here for various reasons. And I've had a wide brief. One of the things that I've been concerned with is water, particularly in the Middle East, and where we try to use technology, if you like, as a leverage for peace out there. But in addition to that, 1.3 billion people worldwide don't have access to clean drinking water. And that's very important because it means that we need new technologies. And then, what's happened to the... I've also been working on approaches to HIV and hepatitis B to try and assess exactly where we are. Is there going to be a vaccine? Well, we know that 40 million people are affected. There's huge implications of the HIV in terms of defense, in terms of feeding and security in Africa. 300 million people are at risk from liver cancer with hepatitis B. All this demands new technology, which really brings us to today. Last week in the Financial Times, a meeting at Boston said, universities and public research institutes, rather than companies, are driving advances in biotechnology, according to a worldwide patent analysis. That's quite important because the role of a university is to create the intellectual property, but then it has to be used. At the annual AAS meeting on science and technology, John Marburger told researchers that Congress and the White House can't keep up with the type of budgetary growth needed to capitalize on scientific opportunities. He suggests more philanthropy. He suggests using industry as another source. And of course, that brings in potential conflicts. Now, in 1985, Oxford University had never had an industrial contract in the 900 years of history. And I was approached by a Monsanto company with a grant of between 50 and 100 million to develop a field which I later termed glycobiology. It's the third great biochemical alphabet. You've got genes and proteins, and you had sugars. And Oxford University didn't quite know what to do with this, never had this kind of money before. And so we had a meeting in Exeter College, which is ring there, and I met together with Lord Crowther Hunt, who was been a Minister of Education, various historians, and we made a decision that it wouldn't be a bad thing to try and get involved in the real world. But it was a tremendous sea change. And you can see here, looking at the meetings there, that's how Oxford lives. It's been that's 1315, and very little had changed. Certainly, they didn't feel that they needed to get involved with industrial funding. We had the Science Museum. We had these wonderful theaters, the oldest museum in the world, wonderful collections. So how were we to go forward? Well, Oxford, as you know, hosts Alice in Wonderland, and that's exactly the kind of situation and culture that existed. And the University Museum had been built in 1850 to answer all of scientific's future plans. It was the time when theology as the power in Oxford was broken. So if you go around Oxford, you see sundials, you see gargoyles, you even see the dodo, which interestingly is in the Science Museum. So what really happened then was I began to convince Oxford that they had been actually in business for a long time. Film sets, Inspector Morse. In fact, here you have Harry Potter was filmed at Christ Church. This was going on. I didn't actually think this was business until I pointed out that in 1478, 2 years after printing, Oxford's first book was printed. It was a commentary on the Apostles' Creed. And therefore, printing then took place in the university. They sort of patronized various businesses. Until in 1553, they got a decree by the Star Chamber which allowed them to print books. But it wasn't until 1632, though, that they could print all manner of books. Some of the first printing took place in the Sheldonian Theatre, designed by Christopher Wren here in 1669. Later, they had their own building. You could just see where I put 1713. That's the Clarendon building. Later, it came from the history by Lord Clarendon, which made enough money to put up a building and later have the Clarendon Press. In 1690, they get the Bible privilege. And that means for 200 years, they can print Bibles, and they make a huge amount of money. The only time they didn't was during the American War of Independence, when the bottom drops out of the Bible market in America. I don't know what that says about America. And so Oxford University, again, were in business. They then take a franchise. They take 42 small printers, and they give them a share in each of these to develop Bibles. And it wasn't until 1890 that they got the shares back again. After all, we heard that Franklin had a printing press, and he actually used to print money. That was a license to print money. Well, this is almost as good. And then, of course, in 1832, Oxford University Press is now dramatically large and powerful as a press. It has its own building, and it then also starts looking at the dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary started in 1884. And by the way, this is the very first picture that we've shown publicly of the original volumes. You can see the last one isn't quite bound. And I've just highlighted the concise Oxford Dictionary just on the side over there. So Oxford University Press was a thriving commercial enterprise. Colleges were actually engaged in commercial enterprises, yet Oxford was still convinced that commerce had nothing to do with it. But in fact, what happened when Monsanto came and produced this very large grant, it was actually much discussed because Oxford and Cambridge are run by an Act of Parliament. There were questions asked in Parliament about whether this money would overbalance the university. Imagine that today. And then, to my delight, the Oxford English Dictionary, University Press, came to my defense because they decided that the word glycobiology had been used in the London Times, in Nature and in Science, and therefore it became a candidate for entry into the dictionary. And so one day, I had a knock on my door. A lady who does the letter G came to see me, and she told me that I'd been chosen to have this entry in the dictionary. And when the dictionary was then published in 1992, they announced the new words that they were going to have, and the Vice-Chancellor said to me that the highest honor anyone could ever have would be to have his name or her name in the Oxford English Dictionary. So there it is. And so what then happened was I set about trying to create a model. As I said, this is a case history for how you might go about doing commercialization. We know that universities are about knowledge, about innovation, and about training. And we know that industry is largely about applications. And so what we did on here is set up, first of all, fellowships. Now that you need people to run it. Technology, very important, you create new technology. That's what's going to drive the science. Patents were very important. Oxford had to learn how to protect intellectual property. Publications, because you have to market what you're actually doing. Journals, and again, Oxford University Press came to my aid. They produced a journal called Glycobiology, which enabled a sense of identity throughout the world in this area to suddenly come into being, and conferences. And then, of course, in 1991, the relationship was so successful that it led to Monsanto, which had then become Searle, and soon to be Pharmacia, and today Pfizer, actually building a glycobiology institute. OGBI stands for the Oxford Glycobiology Institute. And then we had another experiment in Oxford University. We took a group of 20 scientists from GD Searle to help develop an AIDS drug. And while they were doing that, we also developed new technology. They were actually industry employees working in Oxford University under my supervision. And that led to the first spin-off company that Oxford University had ever had where it had been a major shareholder. And so it was Oxford and Monsanto were the major shareholders, and that led to a company called Oxford Glycosciences, which was to take all this technology and make it user-friendly. The first line of that company was it must do nothing to damage the good name of Oxford University. And you can get away with that as long as it's not a public company. But that was how it was driven. And it was very important that anything that happened should not bring the university into disrepute. At the same time, I made it clear I resigned on the first day and had myself reappointed by the university so I could be accountable. And I also made it clear that most of the rewards that would come to me would go to the institute to create an institute, so there would be no question of seeing how any funds, if they were successful, flowed back into the university. Well, it was a very successful company. This shows you just on the left the kind of apparatus we started with. These are the machines they made. And so technology developments went all over the world, and these instruments went into most drug companies. We also developed drugs. Again, how many biotechnology companies ever actually get to develop a drug? They talk about it, they talk about cures, but here we actually got to drugs. The Institute thrived. We have 100 PhD students. We call them DPhil students in Oxford. 160 postdoctoral workers. And you can see the number of publications and patents was very significant. So the university felt very good about this because the money was coming back to support all this institute. And of course, patents suddenly became an important issue. And I spent a lot of time trying at that stage to educate people in how to protect intellectual property and also to have specialist people who would actually help launch it. And it got even better for the university because the technology from the institute went all over the world. We created centers, we cloned centers everywhere else. And with all those centers that we cloned, we created studentships. So we could bring people back to Oxford, we could keep the technology transfer going beyond just Oxford itself. So this really was to be a global vision, not just a vision of looking at a university doing something in isolation. And it wasn't just about the profit, it was about getting the technology out there. In my opinion, it was about accountability, saying we generated the intellectual property. We knew we could make a difference in various disease areas or in diagnostics. We had an obligation to get that out, and we had to do it in such a way that it would avoid conflicts of interest. and we didn't want to change the university's mission. So part of these studentships are all about that, which leads me very nicely to today, because not every model is going to be like that. And then with the advent of ICIS innovation, more generalized models came into being. And so it's now my pleasure to hand over to Tim Cook to talk about the model that ICIS innovation has developed. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. May I start by thanking the John W. Kluge Centre for inviting Tom and me to come from Oxford and to speak, and also thank you for giving your time, whether you're here in body or in spirit, to come and listen to us. In this presentation, we want to address the sometimes problematical issue of the relationship between university research and those commercializing the research results. We start from suggesting that the principal missions of a university are teaching and research. Our definition is not an uncontested assertion, and we could spend the whole seminar addressing the question, what is a university for? Or even the more basic issue of who is allowed to answer question one. Is it the government who finances universities, at least in part? Is it industry whose taxes pay some of the money that the government uses to finance universities, and who employs the graduates from them? Is it all the other organizations who pay for our universities? Is it the citizen who's buying education for the next generation, or is it actually even the university itself who's allowed to decide what it's for? We'll then try and describe the differences of culture that we see between commerce and academic research. We'll then highlight some of the difficulties arising from this cultural contrast and the approach we've taken over 10 years in an ancient and research-intensive university to address them. We do not purport to provide a universal solution or pretend to advise US institutions. We're merely setting out a general strategy describing its implementation in a single UK university. Our hope is that the subsequent conversations will be helpful to a wider audience in industry, government and universities on both sides of the Atlantic and even further afield. So, the start of a fruitful collaboration between universities and industries, we believe, is to understand the differences in the value systems that operate in the two environments. Our strategy is based on a definition of the mission of a university being to create, store, and apply knowledge through teaching and research. Universities can, of course, contribute to economic development through the commercialization of research, but unless properly managed through policy procedures and the allocation of adequate resources, such commercialization can be a real threat to the university's prime mission. This presentation describes the approach taken over 10 years in Oxford and some of the results we've obtained. Like Barry Blumberg, I'll start from Benjamin Franklin, 1743, who said, "The first drudgery of setting up new colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessities, is now pretty well over, and there are many in every province in circumstances that set them at ease, and afford leisure to cultivate the fine arts and improve the common stock of knowledge." Of course, any society needs first to sort out the essentials of physical, economic, and social survival. But after that, as was eloquently expressed by Benjamin Franklin, we should find time to afford leisure to cultivate the fine arts and improve the common store of knowledge. He goes on, all philosophical, i.e. scientific experiments that let light into the nature of things tend to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the conveniences or pleasures of life. This clearly is an essential element of any civilization that wants to prosper. However, whilst it is a necessary condition, it is not by itself sufficient. There are many stages between the discovery of a scientific phenomenon and, in Franklin's words, the multiplication of the conveniences and pleasures of life. Moving forward 44 years to the US Constitution, we read in Article 1, Section 8, "Congress shall have power to promote the progression of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries." So, Progress in science and the useful arts is not new in the USA, and neither is the concept of profiting from it. In addressing the question, what do universities think they're for, we've gone to extracts from the mission statements of 4 universities that are generally accepted as being of high quality. In Oxford, the mission is to sustain excellence in every area of its teaching and research. The italics are ours. Cambridge. Cambridge is a university in the UK as well as one in America. Their mission statement suggests that they would like to contribute to society through the pursuit of education, learning and research. MIT, closer to home, the mission of MIT is to advance knowledge and educate students in science, technology and other areas of scholarship. And finally, moving to the West Coast, Stanford's motto is an invitation to free and open inquiry in the pursuit of teaching and research. Later on in their missions, there is reference to serving the wider community, or some such similar words, which would certainly include industry and commerce. But the clear emphasis in all 4 cases, I suggest, is on teaching and research. So, I would like to assert that the principal products of a university are teaching and research. There are few, if any, alternative sources of these. High-level teaching, particularly in a wide range of disciplines, and more importantly on interdisciplinary interfaces, is limited, I suggest, almost entirely to universities, where the eclectic mix of scientists in all subjects, sociologists, linguists, historians, theologists, among many others, provides a well-informed and highly reactive mixture. There are, of course, some corporate labs that can afford to do real speculative research, but they are few, and we believe that as the commercial climate intensifies and the cost of research increases, they will become increasingly scarce. There are also government labs doing blue sky research, and we have slightly more hope that they will survive the often necessarily short-term thinking of successive governments, each of whom are elected for but a few years. A valuable byproduct of university research is commercializable inventions. We call it a byproduct because there are lots of sources of commercializable inventions. To list a few: corporate research, the lone inventor, the users of the invention who can define the application, etc. In the same way that it would be an error to design a production plant to maximize the output of the byproduct if it prejudices the main product for which the plant was designed, so we believe it would be a serious mistake to let the needs of technology transfer adversely affect the drivers of research. Tech transfer must come at the end of the research if the true goal of knowledge for its own sake is to be maintained. The further we, as technology transfer officers, move up the food chain, the more dangerous we are. Of course, the value then extracted should be maximized to give a return to both society and the university. But we maintain that technology transfer should not interfere with the prime roles of universities, being teaching and the creation of new knowledge through research. Ignoring this could turn some great universities, of which the world has very few, into less than great contract research companies, which we believe the world does not need. Described variously as the third arm, the third leg, or mischievously by a colleague of mine in the UK, the third planet, the generation and commercialization of intellectual property from research results has achieved increasing focus since the change of government in the UK in 1997, who have not only been demanding results, but have also been contributing resources to universities to advance this third limb. In Oxford, we've spent the past decade investigating and developing a system to facilitate the commercialization of inventions made by researchers in the university. But first, I would like to describe the dangers we saw and were keen to avoid. The value systems in academic research and in commercial enterprise are very different. Applying a commercial mindset in an academic context can lead to untenable positions, which I'll demonstrate shortly. Applying an academic mindset in a commercial environment may have similar, but probably less dramatic consequences, because a commercial environment tends to be more closely controlled than an academic one. If I caricature, and this is a gross caricature, of the behavior patterns and values in industry and academic research, you'll see what I mean by the difference. Industry is driven by external needs. It must be driven by external needs. We hear the customer is king. A company must have clear goals with shareholder commitments. If you want someone to invest in your company, you need to be clear what you're going to do with their money. What's more, companies with trade secrets keep them confidential, because they're the crown jewels for the future. On the other hand, in academic researchers are in general self-directed. I was once told that all academics think they're self-employed, and if you tell them they're not, they'll think you're a fool. The next step in any piece of research is defined by what happened yesterday, so it's quite difficult to write a detailed long-term plan. And what's more, an academic career is measured by the quality and quantity of its productions. If I extend my caricature even further, the view from industry is that academics never deliver, and the equally ill-informed view from academia is that industry is out to cheat us out of our intellectual property and probably not pay for it. So therefore, the job that Tom and I have got in trying to develop in cultivating a loving and trusting relationship between these two civilizations, we can expect to be challenging, and indeed it is. Let me give you an example of how a similar question evaluated in both value frames can produce a drastically different answer. If I represent the academic values as a horizontal axis, I could say that the commercial values are orthogonal to this. Some would argue that they actually point in opposite directions. I don't think they do. I think they have very little common projection onto each other. So therefore, if we want them to work together and trust each other, it's a good idea to have bilingual intermediaries who both civilizations can trust. The project managers in ISIS, of which there are about 16, have nearly all got PhDs in a scientific subject, but what is less common is they've all had commercial jobs in real companies, so they're aware of the vocabulary, value systems and prejudices of both parties. Therefore, they can take the academic with them to a company, and the academic will trust the intermediary not to let the company steal their ideas. Similarly, they can take an industrialist to the university academic, and the industrialist can trust the intermediary not to let the academic waste their time. I remind you, I said these were caricatures, but they have an element of truth running through them. The academic axis, and so this produces a license. The academic axis turns money into research, the commercial axis turns research into products, and it all works very well. The intermediaries, however, must have a profound understanding of both cultures. The example I would use is if we're trying to start a company between a Spaniard and a Frenchman, you need more than just to be able to speak both languages. You have to be able to explain Spanish attitudes in French to the Frenchman and French attitudes in Spanish to the Spaniard, and vice versa. The ISIS project managers, as I've said, have some personal credibility, and that is the only common currency we find between these two civilizations. It is, of course, possible to do this without intermediaries. There are lots of academic commercial activities managed by academics, but on the whole, it's easier to drive a car if you've had a couple of driving lessons. And certainly for the academics who are not personally able to do what Raymond did, then it is very important to have intermediaries at least to ignite the process. Here's an example of how it can go wrong. A company licenses in some university intellectual property and pays the university $1 million. The company, quite reasonably, demands rights to the improvements on this patent because they've paid $1 million for it, and the company won't want the academic inventor inventing something that he then licenses to one of their competitors. What's more, the company might equally ask the university if they can have first rights on any other relevant invention made in that university who has benefited to the tune of $1 million. These are very reasonable demands in a commercial environment. However, the university then tries to recruit a leading world authority on the subject which gave rise to this license in the same field. And then they say to Professor Important that his work has been pre-assigned to a company. Now, those of you who live in universities will see that this is an outrageous restriction, and Professor Important probably would not join the university on these terms. Therefore, the same input to the two value frames produces two very conflicting sets of actions. So why does it go wrong? I believe the first problem is a failure to appreciate that the two value systems, academia and commerce, are equally valid, but are different from each other. The same input into the two systems can provide different outputs. In the commercial world, restricting the freedom to operate of employees is accepted. It's quite reasonable. In an academic world, the same restriction is not always viable. It's sometimes superficially viable, particularly at the leading edge of research where the map hasn't been drawn, so even the boundaries of the field may not be unambiguously defined. The approach we've taken to try and avoid these dangers is to recognize the differences, design an interpersonal interface to deal with them, and avoid the temptation to use one value system in the other environment. Someone told me that teaching the majority of academics to deal commercially has as much chance as teaching your cat to bark. It's not really worth doing, because if the academics work in their value system and the company works in their value system and you can interface it, everybody's doing what they're good at. This is very difficult and may require significant diplomatic skills. We don't succeed every time. An additional challenge, if we're talking about creating a spin-out company rather than just a license or a consultancy, there is a third axis. In addition to academia and industry, there are the investors. Investors are not the same as industrialists. I don't have time today to enumerate the differences, but if we've got time at the end, I'll happily do so. So therefore, as well as these two orthogonal dimensions, we have a third dimensional orthogonal to both the other two. And so, to do spin-outs, we need three-dimensional or trilingual intermediaries, or at least a trilingual team which can generate confidence of academic researchers, commercial managers, and also investors. I'll now say a few words about Oxford University. Oxford University is very old. Its first records of teaching date from 1096, and the first overseas student came in 1190, and he was Emo of Friesland. We still have his student records. His thesis is expected sometime within the next year or two. There are currently about 37 departments ranging in alphabetical order from anthropology to zoology, and they're structured into 4 academic divisions. There are 18,000 students from 129 countries, of whom 37% are graduates. The graduate percentage has grown from 20% only 4 years ago to 37% now. Oxford has a very modest financial endowment, particularly compared with universities this side of the pond. Yale has 30% fewer students than Oxford and 2.5 times Oxford's financial endowment. Harvard has 10% more students than Oxford and endowment 4 times bigger. So you can see that things are quite tight over that side. Oxford is a public university, and the principal source of research, I'm sorry, we've done that. Oh yes. The research spend comes mostly from the government. This year it was $606 million. In 1996, it was converted at that exchange rate 166. So you can see that it's almost quadrupled. The sources of funding, the principal source of funding is the government and also the research councils, which is again government money. The allocation of research spend between the 4 academic divisions clearly demonstrates the richness of the medical research, which spends 65% of the $600 million. It also probably reflects the high cost of scientific research compared with that in social science and humanities. This data and any more that you could possibly want is on the Oxford University website, which the reference is here. The resources that the university allocates to innovation permeate the system. They're not in one place. There isn't one place where the innovation takes place. From the University Council through the administration, the academics and students, both graduate and undergraduate. The resources that operate this activity are distributed throughout the structure in the most appropriate locations. So the Research Services Office is located in the university offices and they administer all that research funding. But they also have satellite offices spread around the divisions, so there is local support available for researchers. ICIS Innovation, for which Tom and I work, is a company wholly owned by the university. Commercialization by patents, licenses, spin-outs and consultancy are the responsibility of ICIS. In addition to the Science Park, which Barry mentioned, which is half owned by Magdalen College, the university has its wholly owned Science Park at Begbrook. And that provides premises for research, for business incubation, and for spin-out companies, all on the same location. In the business school, there is a Science Enterprise Centre, which provides business training for scientific researchers, about which more later. There is also a student club, which the last time I looked had 2,000 plus members, several of whom are already running their own companies. This is a partial drawing of Oxford University's structure. We haven't got long enough or enough dimensions for a complete structural drawing. The university's council is advised on intellectual property matters by a group consisting of senior researchers in both science, humanities, and specifically intellectual property law, some of whom are world authorities on their subject, but also members of the university administration, research support, legal, and technology transfer. Not only does this group recommend strategic policy changes, but is also charged with resolving tactical conflicts as they arise. The combination of researchers, officers, and practitioners provides a well-informed policy with input from both those charged with implementing it, the officers, and those whose activities are subject to it, the researchers. There are, as I mentioned, 4 academic divisions: social science, medical science, humanities, and life, maths, and physical science, and an administration. I always draw the administration on a lower level than the scientists, just to remind us who is supposed to be supporting who. These are all the academic divisions, which I won't detail. So the Science Enterprise Centre is in the business school. As I mentioned, they have an evening course called The Basics of Business. Since it started in 2001, 2,000 researchers have come out of their labs on a Tuesday night to go and learn about such subjects as cash flow forecasting, HR, business planning, and so on. The availability of business school faculty and facilities is, of course, a huge asset for this, but the great benefit to ICIS Innovation is that when researchers come to us, some of their proposals are much closer to being finance ready than they might otherwise have been. All research funding is, as I've said, administered in the university's central office, but with the satellites, a model which is followed by ICIS. We have desks in some of the research departments where ICIS project managers sit to chat to researchers. In addition to several privately owned science parks and the Magdalen Science Park, the university has its own business park at Begbrook, which is about 5 miles north of the city centre. Some find it amusing that the title is a combination of beg, as in getting money, and broke, as in not having any. So the key ingredients of this are a rich portfolio of wholly owned intellectual property, a strong world-class research base, very diverse research sponsorship. There are over 700 different sources of research funding in Oxford every year. There is a clear intellectual property policy, which is led from the top and widely accepted. There is investment in research support. The university provides 100+ staff distributed between ICIS Innovation Research Services, the Science Enterprise Centre, and the Begbrook Science Park. There is a clear internal demarcation of responsibility, although I have to admit we do occasionally have some friction on the frontiers, and this is balanced by effective internal and external communication. Part of this is done by having the same people in more than one of these places. So I, for example, am a non-executive director of ICIS and the chairman of the Science Enterprise Centre. Tom lectures in the Science Enterprise Centre and is managing director of ICIS, and so on throughout the system. The intellectual property policy in Oxford was finalised in October 2000, and states that the university claims ownership of all employees' and students' IP rights resulting from university research activities. I have a copy of the full policy on a spare slide at the end if you really want to talk about the details. The university assists those researchers who wish to commercialize the fruits of their research. Note the bold italics on who wish to. No one is forced to commercialize. And we do this by patenting, licensing, helping them start companies, and helping them sell personal consultancy. The researchers share the benefits of this activity. They get royalty shares from the licenses we sign, they get equity in the spin-out companies, and they get income, most of the income, from personal consultancy. The next 3 slides will just outline the policy on these 3 activities. When we file a patent, ICIS Innovation pays all the patent costs. We spent £2.4 million on this last year. When the revenue comes in, we keep it all. We find this very satisfactory, but we're only allowed to do it until we've paid off the patent costs. After that, we keep 30% and send the rest to the university, who distribute it. And the university's rules for royalty distribution are, for the first $100,000, the researchers personally get 87.5%. That's 61% of the gross. This is very generous, and the reason for this is that we want them to undertake this activity, which is outside the job that they thought they were taking when they joined the university in teaching and research. Therefore, they have to be heavily incentivized to start with. Of course, once they're bitten by the bug and the deals get bigger, the researcher's share goes down, and the university itself and the department start taking more, and when the deals are really big, the university starts making bigger shares. When we start a company, the rules for sharing out the equity are less prescriptive. The equity is shared among the academics, and that's not only the names on the patents. The university itself, the investors, and the managers who we want to manage the company. The academic and the university generally get similar amounts. This is not a rule, it's a guideline, and every case is negotiated separately. The investors get what they negotiate for, and the managers get a percentage depending on how much all the rest of the people want to recruit them or not. The important point about this is to note that everyone on the list has an effective veto, because if the academics don't want to start a company, there won't be a company. If the university doesn't want to license its technology to the company, there won't be a company. And if the investors don't invest, nobody gets any money anyway. So therefore, ICIS's role in this is to help these 4 people not fight with each other while the company is being formed. Consultancy. Oxford academics are allowed to consult for up to 30 days a year and keep all the revenue from it. They have to check with the university that they're not selling intellectual property developing to the university, but the financial arrangements under the statutes are a matter for them. However, a few senior researchers are very good at selling their consultancy, but a much larger batch in the middle are not very good at selling consultancy, so they don't do it. 3 or 4 years ago, we started an optional service for academics saying, if you want us to, we will find you opportunities, we'll negotiate your rates, and we'll manage the administration. We also help them understand the perils of doing consultancy without being insured, which we provide them with. If the researcher chooses to use this service, they get 85%. But if we've managed to negotiate for them a significantly higher consultancy rate, there's a net gain. If the researchers use this service once, they don't have to use it again, but of course they always do, because it's a good service. A diagram trying to
explain the transfer of intellectual property from the world inside the university, on the left-hand side of the slides, to the world outside the university. It starts with the Research Services Office, who manage all that funding I told you about. And any technology transfer project in Oxford starts with the researcher coming to ICIS and saying, I have an invention, can we look at a way of commercializing it? And we ask them to fill in a form which only has 12 questions on, one of which is, what was the source of your research funding? That form then goes to Research Services, who look at the terms under which that research funding was taken to make sure that the university owns it. In other words, to make sure it's clean, because we don't want to spend our patent budget and our time commercializing inventions that the university doesn't own. Assuming it is clean, the university assigns those rights to ICIS, and Tom or I sign a piece of paper to accept legal responsibility for this university asset. We then commercialize it, and very often, as a result of this commercialization,
there's ongoing research, because who better to develop this technology than the people who invented it? Those negotiations are referred back inside the university to the Research Services Office. This can be annoying for companies because they're talking to ICIS Innovation about the license and talking to the university about research. In fact, it's not very annoying because both these teams work very closely together. The great benefit of this system is that all the obligations that the university takes on as a result of accepting research funding are held in one place. If you manage contract research outside the university, you could well end up selling the same thing twice, and you won't find out for 3 years until the lawyers arrive. So although this is a labor-intensive system, we know that we only sell clean intellectual property, and we know that any commitments the university is taking on as a result of accepting research funding are held in one place. A few words now about ICIS Innovation. ICIS is a company wholly owned by the university. It's important to Tom and myself that we're a company because we operate under company law, not university law. We are not tied by the timescales of some university processes, which means it's much quicker for us to recruit and indeed fire people. We are wholly owned by the University of Oxford, and that is also very important. It means we can make management decisions based on the university's priorities, which are not anywhere near as simple as how long's the payback time on this particular project. Our job is to help researchers commercialize results of their research. There are currently 38 of us, including 31 graduates, 20 PhDs and 9 MBAs. And our activities are patenting, typical year, file 50 patents, which is perhaps half of the disclosures we see, 45 licenses, 60 consulting and service contracts, and 7-ish new companies. Now, again, concentrating again on the interfaces, let me talk about 3 tribes, 2 transitions, and an exit. This is particularly with regard to spin-out companies. There are 3 distinct groups of people. There are the researchers, there are the technology transferers, and there are the active shareholders. And they have very differing characteristics. So I would suggest that the skills that a researcher requires is doing research. The skills a technology transfer requires are relationship building between people with very different ideas of the way of doing things. And I suggest that the principal role of active shareholders is driving management or supporting management, if you'd like a less pejorative word. The main motivation of researchers is research. You could say, why are researchers not motivated by money? If you look at industrial salaries and university salaries, you'll see that researchers are primarily motivated by research activity. The motivation of technology transfers, what gets Tom and me up in the morning, is actually technology transfer. Looking at all the people in ICIS, we have no employee bonus schemes, we have no profit shares. Every time a new businessman joins our board, he says, why don't you have a bonus scheme? Because that's how we do things in the City of London. The problem with a bonus scheme in a tech transfer office is, you remember our objective is transferring technology, not necessarily making money. Each project manager in ICIS Innovation has about 40 open case files at any one time. If they do a really good deal and earn a really big bonus, they'll have a really big bonus and 1 happy academic. And they'll have 39 unhappy academics, all of whom think the project manager has been spending his time on the project that's going to give them a personal bonus. 39 unhappy academics is not what you want to see if you're in technology transfer. We motivate our staff by their management and by their activities, not by their pay. Of course, we have very differential salaries. People are rewarded well, but not results dependent, not arithmetically results dependent. They are managerially, their results are measured. And of course, the motivation of active shareholders is carried interest because they want to make some money out of this investment. So that's the rewards, I believe, for technology transfers is seeing technology that was in the university outside. That is also a big motivator for the academic inventors, seeing their baby out there doing something. So the university, we look to provide us with clean intellectual property. We provide the shareholders with a spin-out company. They then grow it. And I think the skill sets in those 3 boxes are so distinct that once you put those two into one place, you're already starting to blur the issue. Our philosophy is we support researchers who wish to transfer technology. The researchers' interests are key. Our most critical asset is researcher confidence in ICIS innovation. We constantly remind ourselves on this, and on the occasions we forget it, we rapidly get burned. We generate researcher enthusiasm by internal marketing. We spend a lot of our energy explaining to the researchers what services are available for them. The university intellectual property policy, which is seen to be fair, by particularly employing high-quality staff experienced in both research and industry. I was going to say a couple of words about technology audits. The usual thing when people first go into tech transfer is they say, I know, let's do a technology audit, let's find out what we've got. So the technology transfer executive books to go and see Professor Important. And the result is one of three things after an hour's discussion. Either you take their time and tell them that they've got nothing worth commercializing, or you take their time and they think they have got something worth commercializing and you tell them that you're not going to do it because it isn't really, or you find some gold. Outcomes 1 and 2 are very counterproductive to a tech transfer office trying to establish a loving, trusting relationship with researchers, and there's a better way of achieving outcome 3. This is my caricature of the first method. So you book an audit date, the researcher remembers what they've done for the last 3 weeks, and they remember your visit for the next 3 weeks, so you get about 6 weeks worth of inventions. There are too many researchers in Oxford for this to work. Instead, we operate what I've called a relationship-based technology audit. And what I mean by that is there's an ongoing relationship between the tech transfer staff and the researchers. So whenever they come up with something, if they want to, they know where we are and what services are available. Another way of describing this is to set up a lighthouse to attract researchers. We spend a lot of time and effort on PR directed inside the university through mail shots, newsletters, magazine articles, the web, lectures, handouts. If a department wants an IP training course, we do it. Local radio, local TV, local newspapers is a good way of communicating with researchers when they're at home. And we have found that it is probably more effective than official university handouts, which they keep in their in trays in their labs, meaning to read. And also national media, of course. We attend departmental seminars, college lunches. In other words, the tech transfer staff live in the same world as the researchers, so there's already a social interaction before the professional interaction starts. We believe the sociology of this is the most critical factor in generating a culture change in a university to commit to transferring technology. If we take all the inventions in the university, whether we know about them or not, and we rate their attractiveness, you'll get some sort of curve. The ones at the right-hand end are the ones we want to see. The one at the left-hand end are the ones we don't want to see. I suggest that this attractiveness is a function of two variables. One is the strength of the science, and the other is a parameter which I've called the commercializability of the academic. This is a personal characteristic. Do they turn up on time for meetings? Can they speak English as well as science? Have they got any personal characteristics which are going to deter licensees or investors? Now, if you will accept that anyone doing science in a university like Oxford is going to be quite good at science, S is going to be a constant. So this curve actually reduces to depending only on this personal characteristic of the academic. Now, going back to the lighthouse on the previous slide, and remembering that our office is 2 miles away from the university labs, the ones who are going to seek us out and come and see us are the ones with a high commercializability coefficient. So this fills itself in from the top. So this is all very satisfactory. We've got a self-selecting sample of the people that we want to talk to. But there is a problem, and that is Dr. Quiet. Dr. Quiet has invented some brilliant invention, cure for cancer or something, but he's so quiet and shy that he's never going to come out of his lab. And the model, as I've described it so far, misses him. So the university loses out and the world misses out on this invention. However, in each department in the university, there are now people who are committed to ICIS innovation. They've either made some money from tech transfer, they expect to make some money from tech transfer, or they just think that this is the right activity for a university like Oxford to be engaged in. These are generally the hyperactive, departmental, everybody's friends who are in and out of all the labs in the coffee room, know what everybody's doing. So what will happen is Tom or I will get a phone call from our enthusiast in a particular department saying, get a project manager to go down and see Dr. Quiet. Or sometimes Dr. Quiet rings up and says, I've been told that I've got to talk to you. Either way, he gets dragged up into the killing zone. So we do actually capture these inventions as well. Now, 5 years ago, this was a completely Lewis Carroll model. But because of a deal we did, we actually did a technology audit of the chemistry department and spoke to every researcher, which is something I told you that we never did. That did not produce any major new chemistry projects. In other words, there is now some experimental verification that this is a sensible way for a university like Oxford to self-select the people that we want to talk to. Now, the talk so far has all been fairly theoretical and philosophical. However, ICIS Innovation is a company. It has to submit accounts, it has very active shareholders, and it has a managing director. And over the past few years, we've developed a financial model, which Tom, who is the managing director, will describe to you, so you can see how this rather woolly area of our activity fits into the real world of industry. So let me introduce Tom Hockaday, the Managing Director of ICIS Innovation.
Tim, thank you very much. Tim, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to speak very briefly on a financial model for a technology transfer office which we've developed in ICIS. And as well as looking at the finances of the organization, it also helps to model our activity levels. The key to the model is that it's based on 8 years of real data that we've been able to collect from running ICIS over that period of time. And it's relatively straightforward. We input the known data, we calculate from that known data over the last 8 years derived parameters, and we then ourselves select the key inputs to go into the model based upon the facts and the derived parameters that we've established over the years. And the model then forecasts the activity levels that will result from that. And we start, and this is a key point really, and one of the insights from having collected the data over the 8 years, we start by choosing the number of project managers within the organization. And the reason that we do this is that project managers attract projects, they manage the projects, and they select when to close projects. So the key unit of resource, if you like, in a technology transfer office is the project managers, which has to be supported by a patent budget and preferably other support services as well. But the most important unit within the office is the project manager. So what we've been able to do is look at various factors which contribute to the income into the office, and also factors which control the costs. I would just like to say at this stage and really reiterate a point Tim made a couple of times. Although this is obviously a financial model, the finances of ICIS and our maximization of those finances is not the main objective of ICIS Innovation. Our main objective is to transfer technology out of the university into industry. But it's important that in doing that, we don't lose money, and it's important that given the base of the research we are commercializing, that we can show how we can make money. And thankfully, we're successful in meeting that objective. So we start by looking at the number of disclosures per project manager. And technology transfer starts when a researcher makes a disclosure to the tech transfer office. So that obviously gives us the total number of disclosures. We can then look at the number of projects per project manager to get the total projects. And then we can use the data over the last 8 years to look at the number of deals per project to give us the total deals, the number of income that is generated from a deal to give us the total project income, and the amount of reimbursed patent costs that we get from each deal. We then because of the structure of ICIS as a wholly owned subsidiary of the university, we send some of that money back to the university, as Tim has described. But that gives us the overall parameters for the income side of the business. On the spend side, we're spending large amounts of cash on patenting, so we can look at the patent spend for each project manager and look at the total patent spend. And then, of course, the staff costs are the other main costs, and we know the average cost of a project manager, including in all of the support staff, etc. So we have a model which can look at all of the income factors for tech transfer and all of the cost as well. And so we can produce a forecast P&L for ICIS over the years. And what I want to just look at and show you here is that the way the data has come out over the years. So in this slide, the blue line is the number of disclosures per project manager, and the red line, the number of projects per project manager. And the yellow arrow here, everything to the left of that is based on facts over the years 2000 to 2007. And then we forecast what those parameters will be going forward. And you can see that with those particular parameters, disclosures per project manager, projects per project manager, it's pretty straightforward and easy to forecast what we think is going to happen in the future, because what has happened in the past has been so consistent. We then add in a couple of other factors, and the blue line, the more up and down blue line here, that's the project income per deal. And although that's bounced around quite a bit, you can see an overall projection of that going up. So again, from the yellow arrow here, everything to the left of that is fact, everything to the right is forecast. But we can use that to forecast the average income per deal. And similarly, the pink line is the average amount of patent costs that we get reimbursed from a deal. Now, clearly, there was some variation there, but because there's some human intervention in the model, we know what that variation was caused by. So our assumptions to the right of the yellow arrow can take into account the particular circumstances we know that created the data. And what this gives us is a model here shown for the income that we can predict going forward. So again, to the left of this line, this is what's actually happened in practice, total project income plus reimbursed patent costs. And the model as set here, and remember I said it's all based on the number of project managers in the tech transfer office. This is the outcome if we keep the number of project managers growing at a very slow rate. This, on the other hand, is if we increase the rate of recruitment of new project managers, we can see through that model that we've developed that the total levels of income, reimbursed patent costs, and the amount that we send back to the university obviously increases. What we use this for is planning how to grow ICIS so that it can balance its budget at least, and preferably make a financial return beyond that shown here to the university. And remember that it's based on transferring as much technology as possible, but of course not losing money as well. Thank you. I'll now hand back to Tim Cook to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Tom. In this last section, I just want to talk about what we do about the interface between university and industry. When ICIS was first set up in 1988, one of the really great things it did was started the Oxford Innovation Society. This is a club designed to foster relationships between the university and local businesses. And since then, 90 companies have joined the Oxford Innovation Society. They pay on average $13,500 for a year's membership. And there are some members who have been in since the beginning, some come for 1 or 2 years and then change over. The benefits these companies get are ready access to academics and the university. Well, you might say everybody gets that. They also get advance notifications of all the new patents we're marketing. They don't get rights to these patents, but what they know is that we won't do a deal with one of their competitors that they didn't know about. We organise 3 major meetings a year, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we give customised research presentations and seminars to, for example, the research director of a particular company. They'll come to ICIS. We will introduce one research group every hour for a whole day if necessary. The companies like this because they're talking to researchers about current research. The researchers like it because they're talking to potential users of this research. And we produce newsletters and portfolios, all of which you can get off the ICIS website if you want them. Now, this is the Oxford Innovation Society dinner. It looks like a jolly social event, but I'd like to deconstruct it a bit for you so that you can see it's actually a very devious marketing activity. The meeting starts off in one of the university's lecture theatres. We have a sort of milling around, and then tea and coffee, and then an Oxford academic will give a talk on their subject for plain readers, because the members of the Innovation Society are not only pharmaceutical companies and engineering companies, but they're lawyers, patent agents, venture capitalists, all sorts of people. So therefore, we ask a leading Oxford researcher to talk about their subject in plain language. These are hugely successful presentations. One of the members of the Innovation Society then gives a lecture on a business subject of their choosing to this quite high-powered audience, so it's a good marketing opportunity for them. And we then go off, we have some more champagne, then we go off to a college. Now, this looks like a jolly dinner. The table on the left is the physical sciences table. The one in the middle is the life sciences table. The one on the right is physical science. The one on the left is business innovation and consulting, and there's a top table at the top. Each member of the Innovation Society, of which there are about 40, gets 2 tickets for this, so that's 80 seats. And the rest of the 320 round the table are selected by ICIS, and we select where they sit. So the last one of these we had, the table plan was projected on the wall at a full ICIS staff meeting. We went through all the guests, and project managers could say, could you sit me next to her, and could you make sure that she doesn't get anywhere near him because they'll fight, and all that sort of thing. I know, because I got the last thing, that the table plan was version 20 at the last dinner we had. So the chap with the white hair halfway down the right-hand side of your picture has started 3 spin-out companies, and he's sitting next to a potential business angel investor in his next one, opposite a local accountant specialising in corporate finance. The chap in the grey suit in the middle is an expert in complex genetic diseases, and he finds himself opposite the research director of a pharmaceutical company. They all move around at half-time, so this is horrendously complicated. But after 2 or 3 of these meetings, both the members, the academics, and the service providers, who we sometimes ask, start developing real relationships rather than just business meeting type relationships. So that's the Oxford Innovation Society. I mentioned the Begbrook Science and Business Park. This is being developed by the university at the moment. There are research labs there, there are business incubators, and more important, in the middle there's a meeting room and a cafe. So that's part of the University Department of Materials. They've got a large number of electron microscopes there. I believe they've still got the electron microscope with the highest resolution of any in the world there. And that can be accessed by the web from anywhere in the world, but you have to get someone to put your samples in, of course. There's also a couple of innovation centres where an academic thinking of starting a business can take a room for a month, not a 5-year lease. There's then some established spin-out companies, and because they meet for lunch in the cafe, you get someone who's thinking of starting a company talking to somebody who's just got one, or you have a company that needs an urgent electron micrograph with a friend who's got a really good electron microscope. So as a reaction vessel, this is very powerful. I should say this is only one of several science parks around Oxford. There's another one started previously by Magdalen College, which has a similar activity, but this particular one is wholly owned by the university. A bit of history. This is what's happened since 1997. When I started at ICIS, there were only 3 employees, and I persuaded the university that we should rapidly grow that, and as Thomas mentioned, there's 30-something now. As it grew, we signed some licenses. We started supporting the university's consulting activity in 2002, and you can see that that has grown particularly rapidly. There is a useful spin-out from that activity for ICIS, because having set up consultancy contracts for academics, they then know what nice people they are, so when they make inventions, they're more likely to bring them to us than just publish them. And finally, here's the spin-out companies. So a couple of words about culture change. I believe we're 10-ish years into a culture change in Oxford, from old Oxford, which Raymond described, to, I hesitate to say new Oxford, I'd say the next stage of Oxford. And I think there are three parameters which will track this culture change. The first is the entrepreneurial business culture of the academics. How many Oxford academics are comfortable talking to business people? The second one is the university itself and its tech transfer resource. As you've heard, the university gives Tom and me £1.2 million a year to spend on patents. This is a brave thing for a university to do, particularly a university in the UK where funding is tight. And the third parameter I've called the local professional environment. By this I mean the local banks, the local accountants, patent attorneys, all the people around the university who are the environment into which we want to transfer out our technology. I suggest that all three of these parameters must proceed together, because if it gets out of step, you can see things going wrong. So, for example, if the university does not provide a tech transfer resource, you could see academics signing deals that they don't understand with voracious investors. Or if the local professional environment isn't brought along, you'll be transferring technology into a vacuum. And so I suggest all three must proceed together, but I would go further and say I suggest that if this isn't happening somewhere, the university must lead the change. Because one, the ideas are in the university. So if the university provides the tech transfer resource, you're putting the catalyst next to one of the reactants, so change will happen faster. Before the university started investing in ICIS, Oxford used to do a spin-out company every 4 years. It's now doing about 30 times that rate, and of the 50 or so we've done, we've only had 3 failures so far. So these are high-quality companies. The second reason I think that the university must lead this change is that if the university doesn't lead, the university may well not receive its share of the benefits. So therefore, I suggest that universities should invest in this resource, and not only for financial reasons. For those of you who like life science, here's a model of a university. So imagine the hypothetical case of a university that wants to set itself up as a commercial entity. And you might think, if you've got a gene pool of commercially active scientists, and you've got some other academics, and you've got some executive policies and a tech transfer office, and they're all joined together, you might think that's all we need to do. Now we've got a commercially active university. I do not believe this is the minimum viable organism. I think you should look at a university as a subculture in a barter economy. I'm indebted to Jeff Skinner of University College London for this slide. So there's the university, and of course it's connected with a couple of other universities. Also around it you've got lots of professional organisations, venture capitalists, lawyers, headhunters, accountants, banks, leasing, and you can fill in lots more yellow blobs if you've got the patience, who all exist for their own personal purposes. They're not interested in giving charitable donations to universities. Similarly, you've got lots of individuals, brokers, itinerant managers, consultants, and all the people who swim in this primordial soup. And finally, of course, you've got students, both past, present, and future. And it is only when you've got an organism this complex that you can, I believe, truly think you've got a commercially active university. This is what they started building however long ago it was around MIT and around Stanford. I visited Stanford in '97 and this machine was already there and working well. We started building one of these in 1997 in Oxford, so we're a bit behind but catching up fast. So this is the last formal slide. The conclusions I would like you to draw from this tirade. Opportunities exist in universities both for economic development for their environment, but also for personal wealth creation for the academics and for the institution. To realize these benefits needs an appreciation of multiple cultures and of competent intermediaries to stimulate the initial interaction between them. I think we've begun to develop an understanding of this interface and some systems to stimulate interactions across it. So let me thank you for your attention and invite any questions you may have.
Perhaps I could just interject there. We'll take the questions in a panel in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Tim and Tom. Outstanding presentation. And I'm going to ask Mark Frankel to give us some thoughts he's been listening to this, but of course he's well known in the field himself. Mark.
Oops. Okay, well, good afternoon. I want to thank those involved in convening this session and for including me. I appreciate it, despite the fact that I have never had my name appear as an entry in any dictionary. I'm very impressed. Even the Dictionary for Dummies turned me down. But in any event, in the interest of full disclosure, let me say that I personally support industry-university relationships. I personally support industry funding of academic research. I think it can and does in many ways serve a public interest. However, perhaps unlike Oxford, although I have several questions about the Oxford situation, I don't think we've done it very well in the United States. And I suspect many of you are aware of some of the headlines. Some of you, however, are far too young to be aware of a hearing that was held in 1989 before the U.S. Congress that had the unfortunate title of "Is Science for Sale?" ? Conflicts of interest versus the public interest. I can assure you that that was not a very pleasant experience that day for the university officials who had to attend and be grilled by the Congress. So there are some real problems, I think, in the way that we have done things, and it's, almost 2 decades since that congressional hearing, and we still have our problems. It was just within a few months that British Petroleum announced a $500 million grant to Berkeley and the University of Illinois to look at alternative sources of energy. And it was only 1 week after that announcement that both Science and Nature, two of the more prominent peer-reviewed scientific journals, had long stories in them about the outcry on the part of faculty on those campuses and students as well as to what the implications would be for that kind of relationship given the amount of money involved. Many saw the industry as sort of the 800-pound gorilla that would have an impact on the agenda of the university, the mission of the university. So it was somewhat refreshing to hear what our colleagues from Oxford had to say about what they're doing over there. In fact, at times, to be honest with you, it almost sounded a little too good to be true, but I'm not doubting the veracity at all, and I don't know enough about the situation to comment directly on it, but I do have some questions that perhaps our colleagues from Oxford could respond to, because I'm not sure that I heard the answers to these questions either in their presentation or in the paper that I had an opportunity to see beforehand. ICIS is wholly owned by the university, a company wholly owned by the university. It's not clear to me what precisely that means. What is the relationship between ICIS and the hierarchy of the university? Between a president, a chancellor, your equivalent of a board of trustees? What is that relationship? Who is ICIS accountable to? I'm sorry? Who is ICIS accountable to? And to what extent is the information that ICIS collects and digests and determines in making and uses in its decision-making accessible to others within or outside the university community? I just don't know the answers to those questions, and certainly the issue of institutional conflicts of interest is something that we have to be concerned about. What about student or faculty reactions to the situation that has developed at Oxford, both at the beginning and now? We didn't hear anything about any controversy. I wonder whether there was any, and if so, if you could tell us how the administration or those in support of commercializing the fruits of the scientific labor responded to those kinds of issues. It's hard to believe that there was no concern raised by people who are at the university and perhaps have a different view of the mission than that reflected in ISIS. But if everything went along very well, I'd like to know that as well. And then another question I have, is there any policies related to the rights of students who are engaged in industry-funded research? Have any problems surfaced? We have had conflicts on university campuses over intellectual property between graduate students, postdocs, and their supervisor or thesis director. Has any of that happened in the context of what's going on at Oxford? And if so, how have you managed to resolve it? So in addition to those specific questions, and I was asked to speak briefly just to sort of try to stimulate some discussion, I'd like to finish up with a few general comments about university-industry relationships. We saw a lot of charts presented to us, charts concerning patents, royalties, inventions, economic development, new research labs and buildings, financial models, and that's all well and good. But I think this whole notion of commercialization and industry-university relationships is much more than that. And I'd like to throw a few things out on the table for us to talk about in light of the presentation from our colleagues at Oxford. I'd like to think that one of the crucial issues that we need to consider in thinking about these relationships is the notion of independence. Independence in the sense that professional judgment and advice is based on the best science and not on who paid for it or how much money was generated. A second important value that I hope we'll talk about is trust. That is trust in the integrity of science, the integrity of scientists, and the integrity of institutions, and what, if any, implications for trust arise when you enter into relationships like the one described at Oxford or the ones that I've alluded to here. A third value I think is very important is transparency. The idea here is first, of course, to minimize misunderstandings as well as to facilitate the scrutiny from the outside to ensure some sort of accountability. And a fourth measure that I want to mention is public confidence. We would like the public to appreciate both the value and the values of science in order to support the research enterprise as well as to reap its benefits. Now, all of these factors, values, measures, if you will, have sort of two faces. One face is steeped in reality, and the other face is steeped in perception. And sometimes they mirror one another, but sometimes they don't overlap very much. The poet T.S. Eliot once wrote that humankind cannot stand very much reality. I think he must have been talking about the political process in the United States. But I think, to be honest, there's a lot of social science data which tells us that in the policy arena, most people don't know what the reality is. They are reacting to some perception of reality. The situation is far removed from them. It's very complex, and so they often go to trusted sources of information, whether that be the Washington Post, some internet site, or a neighbor. This is the kind of public that views these industry-university relationships from their particular perspective. So I think if the university and industry partnerships are really to thrive in the United States, at least, I think it's very important that they not only operate in a manner that earns public trust, but they also appear to operate in a manner that earns public trust. Let me give you an example that happened very recently to make the point. There was a relationship established between Stanford and ExxonMobil to look at other energy resources. And there was an advertisement that ExxonMobil ran on television. It was not in all parts of the country, so I don't know how many of you have seen it, and it even appeared in some newspapers. And this is what it said. It's a short paragraph. Kids, they'll tackle almost anything, as you saw children playing in the background. An approach we can all learn from. So ExxonMobil has teamed up with Stanford University to find breakthrough technologies that deliver more energy while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's a challenge, but we're getting there. Sounds good. but at least to one very prominent donor to Stanford University, it created such an adverse reaction that he called the president of the university, and given the amount of money he's given in the past, I suspect he got through rather easily, and said he refused to donate any more as long as Stanford remained in that kind of a relationship. Now, what troubled him? What was he troubled by? It had absolutely nothing to do with whose name was on a publication. It had absolutely nothing to do about the specific arrangements of the relationship or the research. His view, his perception was that ExxonMobil was using the legitimacy of Stanford University to give ExxonMobil a certain amount of credibility and prominence in the public, and ExxonMobil is putting its message out much more widely. So I think the message that I want to leave you with is that no matter how virtuous you think as a university researcher or a university administration, your relationship is with industry, you have to remember that there are lots of other people out there looking at it and perhaps looking at it from a different angle. And in the final analysis, they're going to be less concerned about the specifics of the research and much more concerned about such things as independence, trust, and transparency. And those, I think, are the core values of the university. They certainly should be the core values of science, and those are the kinds of things we need to preserve with regard to the conduct and support of research in the United States. So I leave you with some ideas to think about, and perhaps we can have some good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That's indeed food for thought and stimulating. What I'd like the panel to do is sit where they are, and I'm going to ask Tim to respond to those three questions, or Tom, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So, Tim, do you want to respond to who owns ISIS, who's it accountable to?
I'll do the easy ones, and Tom can do the tricky ones. ISIS has a board of directors, like all companies. Members of the board of directors are one outsider from the banking industry, one outsider from the engineering industry, one outsider from the pharmaceutical industry, 5 senior academics, of which one is Raymond, the university's finance director, the university's deputy finance director, and the company secretary is the university employee who is company secretary to all the university's subsidiaries. So that's the formal structure. What I mean when I say the university owns ISIS is the shares are registered in the university's name. In terms of reporting, we have a formal report every 6 months to the University Council with words and numbers in, and the University Vice-Chancellor gets a copy of Tom's Managing Director report.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I mean, so in short, I think that being a wholly owned subsidiary of the university, it essentially in many ways means we are very much part of the university. Our different status gives us operational and management advantages, but there is nothing we do which is not available and open to the university. And any question they ask us, we answer as quickly as possible if we haven't already done so.
Mark, does that answer your question?
Enough for me to pass and open it up for discussion and questions from the audience.
Thank you. Well, we will open it up for discussion, and I'm going to ask Tomoko Steen, who, if she'd like to make a contribution or say something. Can you hold the microphone? No, I can hear you.
He's the only one that can go.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, the direction. Sorry, my PhD is in Science and Technology Studies, which is communication between the scientists and the public and policymakers. So we are standing as a scientist, trained as scientists, but it's a bridge between the public and the scientists who tend to stay in the ivory tower. And this Oxford model is a really one of the excellent one to move toward that direction. And one small question for it is, do you have that kind of training in your university also for the science communicator? Business training for scientists is an excellent one, but also the science communicator, that's one question. And also some of the critical scientists tend to say science is in general socially constructed. So if we ever make funding, the scientists have to kind of follow the shape of the science, and that is really socially acceptable or the ethically correct. That's a question also have. And we have some international guests here from Japan, for example. So this kind of model works for the other countries. And also we only heard from the Oxford case, but other UK universities have the kind of model exist. And the last question is, because I was educator before, and the students come to science field, they said they have a mission to find some cure of cancer type of thing. And if we emphasize so much on the commercialization of the scientific research, how do I say to students, we do the research to make money? That's the question.
Well, before I pass those to the panel, just let me make a couple of points. First point about ethical research. Most universities do have ethical research policies. So, for instance, many universities will not accept tobacco money. They will not accept money to work on, say, nerve gases. Oxford has a very well-defined policy, and so because you have the money and want to fund research, it doesn't mean that it will be accepted. Certainly will not be accepted in Oxford. And where there is doubt, it can be referred either to an ethics committee or the committee that Tim and Tom mentioned, the Intellectual Property Advisory Group, which also has an ethical dimension to it. We have an ethicist sitting on that committee. So ethical research, yes, it is done. In fact, Oxford is even considering extending an ethical patenting policy, so that once we have patents here, we will consider favorably the exploitation in the third world, and that's something that's currently being developed. Mark's point comes into your point too, because what Mark is saying is no matter how well a model works, there are always potential for conflicts, and one has always got to be vigilant. So I think that answers the second point. The first point, Tom, is yours.
Well, to talk about the activities in Oxford which raise awareness of entrepreneurship for the scientists throughout the whole university. Within the business school of the university, there is a science enterprise centre, and that holds a range of formal events. In particular, it has a series of talks called Building a Business, which is 8 evening lectures run 3 times a year, and regularly gets attendances of over 250 people, predominantly young undergraduate and postgraduate researchers in the university who listen to talks about how to develop business ideas based upon their research activity. And obviously they can take it or leave it. But there's a lot of informal activity as well, in that a lot of the colleges of the university have groups that get together and talk about entrepreneurship and invite it back to the university and to their colleges, successful business people, so they can debate the opportunities, the pros and cons of getting involved in commercializing science. And the researchers who come to us at ICIS, one of the reasons that tech transfer takes a long time is that researchers, to a certain extent, have to go on a journey to decide whether or not they want to bother with this sort of activity. So there's a lot of informal conversation about the sorts of issues that have been raised. Is this something a researcher wants to get involved in or not? And to go back to one of the primary points that we made earlier about ICIS, we exist to help researchers who want help. There's a lot of researchers who don't want to get involved in commercialization, and we're very happy not to help them.
But I think, Tomoko, there's another point that you made, which is a point that's generally made about, student turns up, I want to work on project X. But actually, life isn't like that, and that's, again, slightly unrealistic. A student applies to a particular person to work in a particular lab on a particular topic. Students are they're not sort of completely free in the sciences to do what they, simply to do what they wish. They can choose an area, but once they enter a lab, they enter the discipline of that lab, the structure of that lab. They will know before they enter that lab whether there's a commercial affiliation with that lab, and they can choose perhaps not to do it, or they could take the attitude, this commercial affiliation will enable us to see our application applied, and we can become more accountable. If the cure for cancer really is there, we can see it developed. So you see, it works. So it's a kind of scare story that's often put out, but doesn't actually hold up in reality if the university is managed well. I don't know whether, Mark, you'd like to say anything on that.
You know, I would certainly hope that, as you said, there are policies in place to deal with these kinds of issues. I did raise the issue about what policies governing the rights of students who get involved in such research. Once they are involved in it, you know, the extent to which they are aware of what their obligations are and what their responsibilities are, what their mentors' responsibilities are, and when it comes time to writing and publishing, what access they will have to that kinds of data. I'm assuming all of that is spelled out. It's hard for me not to believe that it isn't, given what we've seen. That was just the point I was raising. I just didn't know the extent or breadth of scope of these kinds of policies there.
It is spelled out, and you've got a great organization looking at it. I'd like to ask Barry Bloomberg if he'd like to say a comment or two.
Well, it was very interesting to me to hear the progress of ISIS innovation and what's happened at the university, having had some experience at the early parts of this. I think a central point that was made by the presentation about ISIS innovation is that the goal is not to maximize the amount of income. Now, and that the goal is to transfer the research. Now, I know at some institutions, there is actually a pressure on the scientists to maximize income. And that I think can be detrimental. Now, another point that came out in showing the financial figures is that the total amount that's contributed to the university is a very small fraction of their annual budget. Do you actually have a figure on that?
Could I have the projector back on? It's very difficult in the short term to quantify this, but if I can have my slides, I've got an analysis of 5 years where the... Oh, can you go right to the end? Yeah. That's it. This is an analysis. If you look at the first 5 columns of this, there was £1 million a year for 5 years. I reckon that the university had £44 million back from that 5-year period. If you will take into account the return the university had from its licenses, the research the university had from the companies we started, the equity it had in the company we started, the £20 million it got as part of its new chemistry lab from a company that we'd worked with and introduced it to. So you've got to add together returns in a variety of currencies if you want to see the total financial impact of this operation. But I repeat, the objective was not to make money. We just happened to return about 9 to 1 on a £5 million investment.
At our institution, we never, at Fox Chase Cancer Center, we have a certain amount of income, but we rarely expect it to be more than, let's say, 5, 10, 15% of our budget. And I'd be surprised if it's very much more than that at most research institutions. But again, getting back to the central point, that the objective is to transfer information to use and not to maximize the amount of money. And that, if that actually happens, based on this talk, we have every reason to believe it does, that I think is a good kind of compromise. A central issue which has been touched on is the increasing secrecy about research because of its potential commercial use and patentability. And I wonder if we could have some input from Mark about this or some of the others.
Well, just very quickly, there has been some empirical survey work done regarding that. And it certainly, in some fields, it seems to be more so than in other fields. The people in genetics research seem to be experiencing more of this than in some other fields. It also varies, I think, depending upon the university culture and the agreement that is made. But I don't think there's any doubt that secrecy has been a characteristic of some of these. My problem is secrecy up front. I think it's terribly important to try to involve as many important stakeholders as possible in these kinds of negotiations and relationships, and that the industry involved just has to accept the notion that they're going to have to be responsive to the concerns raised by a variety of different stakeholders and make the thing a little bit more transparent than it has been.
When I was running the Department of Biochemistry at Oxford, which is very large, I never allowed contracts for secret research. I argued that there had to be an exchange of ideas, and if there were to be research that couldn't be discussed easily, then it shouldn't really be done in the department. On the other hand, the academic person can be responsible. It doesn't have to talk about waters coming on either side. The academic person can be responsible and not necessarily, thanks very much, it's patented, and not necessarily talk about every result. So, but academics, I think, understand that. But the idea that you would have secret research going on actually leads to enormous conflicts of interest. Because, for instance, if it's all contained within the university, it's straightforward. As soon as you move outside university, supposing you have a startup company, and you're a director of that startup company, there's secret research going on. You come into a department, you have coffee, you find out, you get some ideas, you're stimulated. You have, in effect, stolen that little bit of intellectual property from the person who's been speaking to you. So you have to be, so it's not easy to have spin-off companies and commercialize research. But you have to know where all the pitfalls are, and that's why what Mark says is really crucially important. We have a wonderful model, it works, but it doesn't mean that it's not without, it's got to have checks and balances all the time. Are there any other questions? Yes. Could you identify yourself?
Sure. I'm Adam Rosenberg with the House Science and Technology Committee. My question is just, are you aware of any American counterparts to ISIS at any major American university?
Oh, certainly. I'm going to leave somebody out, but I would say, and Tom can add a few, certainly MIT, Stanford,
well, there's an association.
Columbia.
There's an association in the United States, the Association of University Technology Managers, and they meet at least annually, and the room is usually filled with about 2,000 members of what is beginning to be called a profession.
It started here a lot earlier than we started it.
So, do you view an advantage to your model? Do you see an advantage to your model over the American model?
It's not that different. I mean, the point is, when you're designing a tech transfer office for a university, you need to have a profound understanding of how that particular university works, one. Two, how that particular university's environment works. The research funding model in the US is a lot different from the UK. So therefore, I mean, and even in the UK, when I'm advising other universities, we don't just take the model and sell them the model. The first thing you have to do is try and work out how a university works, and that is rarely a trivial activity. So I think that the best way of characterizing them is, one, going right back to my first slide, which is universities are for teaching and research. We never seek to ban publication. We sometimes, with agreement, delay publication by 3 months, but universities is universities. And I think a lot of Mark's points, once you concede that the university has got to start being business-like, you start getting into sticky water because you've got a dual value system operating in the same environment.
Yes.
Yes, Eric Fisher from the Congressional Research Service here at the library. Years ago, when I was a graduate student, the idea of having an organization like ISIS, at the university would have sent shudders through the room in my department, which was zoology, since nobody wanted to do applied research. Several years ago, when I was talking to a head of a tech transfer office at a university, she said that one of the problems she was running into is that everybody wanted to have the next $1 million mouse. So my question is, clearly there's been some change in culture as a result of all the advances in tech transfer. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'm wondering whether you have seen any effects of a change in the research culture, particularly, I mean, at the most basic level, are scientists more interested in doing research with applications as opposed to investigating fundamental phenomena of nature, sort of the curiosity-driven research, or do you see there no impact at all, or what?
You may be underestimating the single-mindedness of university scientists. There was a piece of work done in Belgium by someone called Conrad de Backere who looked at the publication records of scientists before and after they took part in commercialization. And he found, one, their number of publications went up. Two, the number by which they went up was not in applied journals, it was in pure science journals. And my conclusion from that is that hyperactive people remain hyperactive.
I think, sorry, Tom.
Well, I was just going to add to that, I think what has happened that I've seen is there's an increasing interest in technology transfer. And that, to support Tim's point, that doesn't mean there's an increasing interest in doing applied research at the expense of doing less pure research. But yes, researchers are a lot more interested in exploring mechanisms by which the results of their research can be transferred from the university research base out into business and society.
Well, most of the students that I've dealt with, and I've only been in academic life for 44 years, all would like to see something applied from their research. So they want to solve a major problem. Now, of course, there are intellectual problems which they want to solve too. But I think you can think of a model like the beginning of the century, the last century, where in Victorian times, people thought whatever you worked on, there would be some value to it. There would be a periodic table of culture, a periodic table of knowledge, and every little bit you worked on the stomach of a hedgehog, it was going to be important. We now know that isn't true. We also have globalization, so what you do and what I do is communicated very, very quickly, and we know whether it's relevant or not relevant. And I think most people now have begun to understand that we're actually paid, scientists are paid from the public purse. And perhaps they not only have to give back innovation, but perhaps they also have to be accountable. And being accountable means seeing the results applied. Now, you can stand back and give it all to the university and say, there's nothing I want to do with the model, let the university develop it. But the university generates the IP, and I think that today the culture is such that we have a duty to try and exploit that IP. That's what I think at the moment. Yes. Can you take the microphone?
Is that time? My name is Akira Masaike, Director of Japan Society for Promotion of Science and Professor Emeritus of Kyoto University. And I was a member of International Technology Review Panel for International Linear Collider. I'm a particle physicist, so we are responsible to have new field for physics. That's the reason I worked for this International Technology Review Committee. I was so impressed your Oxford panel. But still, I'm thinking it is not so easy to apply to my field, high energy physics, I mean the particle physics. In our case, of course, technology is very important. But first of all, it is so expensive. So we have to construct a big accelerator. And it takes for so long time, maybe 20 years or so. And then we can find very important result of the new field of physics. But it is very hard to apply this for real industry or like that. But we believe it is a very important asset of our generation to the future generation of humankind. So I believe it is very important. Even the application, it takes so long time. Maybe the last half of this century, we can apply something like that. But another point I'd like to point out is you said that spin-off. I mean, to have such kind of accelerator or the detectors, we need very important technology. And to develop such kind of a technology, it takes long time and so expensive. But after achievement of such kind of technology, it can be applied for other fields. It is also a very important point. So I believe that another model has to be think about for application for our field. That is my comment, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a good point. Barry, would you like to comment on that? And then I'll ask Tim.
Well, I can't comment directly on elementary particle physics, but what often happens in research, there may be some basic science investigation that goes along in a particular direction. And then quite often there's a development, a technical development, which doesn't appear to be directly related. Directly related to the project, but has great application, very often in totally different fields. A case in point is not entirely applicable, of course, but when the space research, when there was human flight, there was a necessity to monitor the humans all around the world, their heart rates and EKGs and respiration and so forth, in order to allow this mission to take place. Well, in order to do that, the NASA and the space agencies had to develop sensors that could be comfortably put onto the astronauts, and that the information could be transmitted by radio, essentially. And in order to be able to follow them around the world, you had to have satellites that could pick up this information in the Earth orbits, and also when they went to the moon. Well, when you go into a intensive care unit now, and a nurse is sitting in a central location, that's based to a very large extent on that technology, which really wasn't envisioned at the time. And the ability to get real-time television reports was based on the programs and the technology that was developed. So that wasn't envisioned at the time this research project started, but the applications became apparent after a while, because there was an organization set up that was actually looking for these. And again, your field is much more pure science and applied, but there have been, I'm sure, examples of this unexpected but very important applications.
Tim.
Yes, I can just see you. I would say that it's not always the leading edge science that produces the best commercial opportunities. And I think in the field of high energy physics, particularly if it's practical high energy physics, the development of instrumentation, the development of software, the development of algorithms, that's where I would look for things that were going to produce some funding before you invent a new particle. But it may be, and there's absolutely no reason why every field of research must produce commercial outputs. That's the whole point of having a university, where the ones that can do and the ones that can't don't.
Right, I'm going to take the last question from Tomoko. There's one over here.
One more, my experience I'd like to share. I had an interview with the company executives who fund university research. And something very interesting to me is that they said it's much cheaper, but also the more longer term research can be done in universities. And while, you know, their researchers in the companies are really too expensive to use for some small potential but very, very interesting research. And that's a comment I heard from Japanese company, the executives as well as American company executives, and I think that works for this model.
It's an interesting comment, but of course, that's an old-fashioned comment, because today one has to worry about the full, true commercial cost of doing research. And that's what the university overheads are all about. So, Harvard might be 110%. With the true economic cost of doing research, there's not that much difference between doing it at a university and doing it in industry. Universities are no longer cheap options. Universities provide innovations, and I think that's really the point. And what I would encourage industry to do is invest in universities, invest in their innovative skills and their training skills. That's what universities are good at. I want just to end with one slide. I think, can I have Tim Cook's slides back? It's one slide at the end.
Next to the last one.
The penultimate slide, which I'd just like to end with. Tim, and then I'll say a word.
When a new employee joins ICIS Innovation, I've produced this slide to help them manage their relationship with the university, and I'll share it with you. Managing a university is like leading an elephant with a thin rubber band. That's the university, and that's you. And the procedure I suggest you adopt is you walk along with the elephant in whichever direction the elephant chooses to go, until it gets used to you and starts to trust you. You can then start to pull gently on your rubber band. But if you pull too hard or too suddenly, you will break your rubber band and have no further influence over the elephant. But don't think you will ever have complete control. Thank you.
On that basis, I'd like to thank Tim and Tom coming from Oxford and giving us such a fantastic presentation. I'd like to thank Mark Frankel for giving us his wisdom and his wit, and Barry Bloomberg for helping me to put together this conference, and also to our director of the Kluge Center, Carolyn Brown. There's going to be a reception now where we can continue talking. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to all the speakers for making it such an impressive and intellectually stimulating afternoon. Thank you.